my name is Margaret Silas-Buchan, and I will be presenting today on subsection 2635-702, the use of public office for private gain. There is a lot to cover in this one little subsection, so I will try to be as concise as possible. Next slide. First, we should identify why subsection 2635-702 is so important. Known colloquially as subpart G, the public office for private gain regulations are located within subpart G of the Standards of Conduct. Next slide. Subpart G is vital to preserve public trust of government. The Subpart G regulations were developed to ensure that public servants perform their jobs in the interest of public service. After all, we want to ensure that our public officials are acting in the interest of the wider democracy and not just their own interests. Next slide. As you can see, Subpart G covers a lot of ethics issues. It is intended to cover a variety of ways that public servants can misuse their positions. Of course, public officials can misuse their positions in many different ways, from mishandling non-public information to misusing government resources. But today, we will only be focusing on 702, use of public office for private gain. Next slide. (2635-702) starts with the general standard for the public office for private gain regulations. As you can see here, the regulation specifically states that a federal employee shall not use his public office for 1, themselves, 2, endorsement of any private business or service, or 3, for the benefit of their friends, relatives, or persons they are affiliated with. Note that this regulation is fairly general in its application. The specific prohibitions set forth in paragraphs A through D of Section 702 apply this general standard, but they are not intended to be exclusive or limit the application of this section. Next slide. This means that while the subsections that we'll be discussing in this slideshow will provide specific examples of how the regulation should apply, we should not assume that the application of 702 is limited by these scenarios. As you will see, the world of possibly using one's public office for private gain is endless. Next slide. Keeping in mind how broadly subsection 702 applies, here are this presentation's 3 main takeaways. First, as we've already noted, the application of 702 is broad. Second, and we will get into this further during our presentation, subsection 702 issues are constantly evolving. Third, there are some key issue areas where subsection 702 frequently arises, and you should proceed with caution when handling ethics issues related to those matters. Next slide. Of course, we will need a roadmap as we navigate our way through the world of 702. The displayed list shows the upcoming order of our presentation. Please note that in the interest of time, we will not be covering subsection 702E. Next slide. Our first stop is 702A, Inducement or Coercion of Benefits. The basic framework of 702A is that it prohibits government employees from using their public office to get someone to give them a benefit. An inducement is getting someone to give you a benefit in exchange for something, whereas a coercion is pressuring someone to give you a benefit. 702A covers both inducement and coercion. Next slide. Let's look at some examples. Please take a moment to review the examples on the screen. Here we have a scenario in which Amanda is an employee of the FTC. Amanda's mother has a retirement account through Big Bank. Unfortunately, Big Bank seems to have lost some of Amanda's mother's funds. Amanda is now trying to get that money back for her mother. She resorts to using her FTC position for her mother's benefit. Amanda first induces Big Bank to restore her mother's account by assuring the Big Bank manager that she can make sure Big Bank's SEC audit next year goes smoothly. Essentially, Amanda is offering to exchange the government benefit, an easy SEC review, in exchange for money. Amanda also coerces Big Bank by warning the president that she could use her SEC position to make things very difficult for the company. This is coercion. Next slide. Here are some further examples of inducement and coercion before a non-financial benefit. Please take a moment to review. In this case, we have Vidya, who is a senior ethics official with the Department of Commerce. Vidya's friend Justin seems to have run into some trouble using his commerce computer to mine Bitcoin. Fortunately for Justin, Vidya has stepped in to try to save Justin's job. Similar to Amanda, Vidya is using her position as a senior ethics official to both induce and coerce Justin's manager to allow Justin to keep his job. Vidya induces Justin's manager by invoking her senior ethics position in order to convince the manager that Justin has not committed any ethics violations. And Vidya also coerces Justin's manager by warning him that he could face consequences for firing Justin. Next slide. Next, we will cover the appearance of government sanctions. Keep in mind, this subsection is primarily concerned with appearance concerns, namely, whether it appears that the government has sanctioned a personal activity. Next slide. Take a moment to read the examples on this slide. We have two examples on this slide. First, we have Carl with the Department of Treasury. Carl's friend Mario has asked Carl to be a reference on Mario's personal loan application. Carl can be a reference for Mario's personal loan application, but he may not refer to his position with Treasury. One major takeaway from Carl's example is the requirement to avoid referring to a federal position in order to support a personal reference. This can often be tricky, as we can assume that Big Bank may ask for Carl's profession and title on Mario's loan application. Our next example, Malcolm, is an astronaut from NASA. Malcolm loves both his job and animals, so much so that he regularly volunteers with his local animal shelter. While promoting a fundraiser for the animal shelter, Malcolm took to introducing himself as a NASA astronaut that loves animals. Malcolm's example is a bit more clear-cut. Malcolm cannot reference his position with NASA while fundraising for the animal shelter, as it may appear that NASA sanctions the animal shelter's activities. Next slide. My next example involves a scenario I'm sure many ethics officials are familiar with. Books. Please take a moment to read the example. Here we have a scenario in which Christine is a senior U.S. attorney. Christine's friend, Julia, is writing a book. Julia has asked Christine to help her with the book by writing an introduction and participating in Julia's book tour. Christine is free to write the introduction to Julia's book, but she may not reference her title, position, or government role in the introduction. Similarly, Christine may join Julia on her book tour, but she cannot reference her government position while doing so. Next slide. We are now moving on to an issue that often comes up in the context of government sanctions, letters of recommendation. Keep in mind that letters of recommendation appear within the 702B subsection. They do not have their own subsection. As the slide says, an employee may sign a letter of recommendation using their official title in response to a request for a recommendation or character reference based upon personal knowledge of the ability or character of an individual with whom they have dealt in the course of federal employment or whom they are recommending for federal employment. Next slide. Here are some letters of recommendation examples involving Emily from the Department of Justice. Please take a moment to review the slide. In these examples, Emily directly supervised Max as an intern, but she did not directly supervise Ahmed. Note that Emily may write a letter of recommendation for Max, as she has firsthand knowledge of his ability and character after she supervised him as an intern. Emily may use DOJ letterhead and reference her DOJ position in the letter for Max. However, Emily cannot write the same letter of recommendation for Ahmed, as Emily did not supervise Ahmed directly. Emily may write a letter of recommendation for Ahmed, but she cannot reference her DOJ position or title, nor may she use DOJ letterhead. Next slide. Here are some helpful resources for tackling government sanction issues. Legal Advisory 1408 is particularly helpful when evaluating instances of government sanctions. This legal advisory outlines factors that help determine whether there is or is not government sanction of an outside activity. Be sure to use this legal advisory when assessing whether an outside activity appears to have been unethically sanctioned by a government employee. Next slide. We are now moving on to endorsements under 2635-702C. Please note that while the application of the endorsements regulation is broad, it has two key exceptions. Endorsements are allowed, 1, in furtherance of statutory authority to promote products, services, or enterprises, or 2, as documentation of compliance with an agency's requirements, or for recognition for achievement in support of the agency's mission. This second exception specifically applies in instances where private companies have complied with government restrictions or regulations. FDA approval is a common example of this. Next slide. Here are some examples of endorsements. Please review the examples. In these examples, we have Brendan from TSA. Brendan is responsible for running the TSA social media account. In the first example, the Vagabond Suitcase Company has asked Brendan if he can advertise their suitcases on TSA's social media account. Brendan cannot advertise for Vagabonds on TSA's social media account, as it would be considered an endorsement of a private company. In the second example, Brendan's supervisor has asked Brendan to publicly share information about which suitcase brands have been approved for carry-on luggage. Note the differences between these two examples. Brendan cannot advertise for a specific suitcase company on TSA's social media account, but he can note which suitcase companies satisfy TSA security requirements. Next slide. Finally, we have 2635-702D, which is essentially a catch-all provision. 702D relies heavily on the 2635-502 reasonable person standard. Additionally, 702D prohibits the misuse of an employee's position for another's financial benefit in scenarios where imputed interest under 18 U.S.C. 208 may not apply. Next slide. Please take a moment to review the examples involving 702D on this slide. Here we have an example involving Michelle from the Department of Energy. Michelle's childhood friend Laura owns a solar panel company, and she's applied for a government contract with the Department of Energy. Michelle should not award Laura's solar panel company a contract, as she would be using her position as a contract specialist with the Department of Energy for Laura's financial interests. Note that even though Laura's financial interests are not imputed to Michelle under 18 U.S.C. 208, Michelle is still prohibited from acting in her friend's financial interests. Next slide. Here we have another example involving Jean and their cousin Patrick. Please take a moment to review the example. Jean is a patent officer at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Patrick has developed a 3D fax machine and applies to patent his invention. Jean reviews Patrick's patent application and chooses to award it. Jean's decision to award Patrick's patent is also in violation of 2635-702D. Note that intellectual property is considered a financial interest. And although Patrick is Jean's relative, Patrick's financial interests are not imputed to Jean under 18 U.S.C. 208. This is another way that 2635-702D can prohibit the misuse of one's public office for private gain of a relative, even if that relative's financial interests are not imputed to the government official under 18 U.S.C. 208. Next slide. This slide is a quick recap of the subsections and examples we've reviewed thus far. I've included references to each example to try to jog your memory of the various scenarios. Next slide. For the next two slides, I want to cover subjects in which the 702 regulations frequently apply: social media and fundraising. And you already saw these two subjects frequently come up in the examples in our slideshow. These are important topics that OG receives a lot of feedback on, and they involve cutting-edge legal issues. These slides are intended to provide additional references for 702 issues. In the case of social media, legal advisories LA 1503 and LA 2109 are particularly helpful. LA 1503 is specifically written to cover ethics issues that may arise in the use of employees' personal social media accounts. For example, if you have a scenario in which an employee has displayed their government position on their personal social media account, then this would be the legal advisory for you. LA 2109 was written in response to an agency's request to use employees' personal social media accounts for an advertising campaign. As you can imagine, there were many 702 issues that arose in relation to this proposal. Next slide. And in cases involving fundraising, I highly recommend that you check out legal advisories LA 1901 and LA 2007. LA 1901 was written in response to ethics issues that arose during the prolonged government shutdown in 2019. This legal advisory discusses what ethics issues may arise for federal employees during a lapse in funds. For example, we had many issues arise involving crowdsourced fundraising for federal employees that were furloughed. Obviously, such fundraising was contingent upon their federal employment at the time. This legal advisory addresses many of the crowdsourced fundraising issues that affected federal employees during the government shutdown. LA 2007 covers a variety of issues that employees may encounter when they're involved in crowdsourced fundraising, such as GoFundMe campaigns. Importantly, this legal advisory explains that it is very risky for federal employees to engage in crowdsourced fundraising. We strongly recommend that federal employees consult with their ethics officials before participating in crowdsourced fundraising. Next slide. Finally, we will conclude with our main three takeaways from this presentation. If nothing else, I hope you come away with understanding these main components about subsection 702. First, the application of subsection 702 is intended to be broad. There are many ways that employees may use their public office for private gain. Second, 702 issues are a moving target. Available legal guidance may not cover all possible scenarios. And three, certain activities create greater risk for 702 violations, especially social media and fundraising. Proceed with caution when handling such ethics issues. Next slide. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you came away with a deeper understanding of subsection 702.